As Liz says, I'm Gary Bratchford. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Central Lancashire, which is UCLAN. And I'm also the course leader for the MA in photography. And I'm very excited to be co-hosting this event with Liz and the Socially Engaged Photography Network. And I guess the reason why I took the opportunity to do the co-hosting event with Liz, aside from the fact that I've worked with Liz before in a socially engaged capacity, is that I have an institutional interest in what socially engaged practice can do, and particularly photography. Of supervising PhDs, managing an MA which tries to engage in some sort of self-reflexivity, and how do you identify research through your practice, which I think is quite an interesting thing for us to discuss. And also, I guess more broadly, at UCLAN, they're keen to do more PhDs that focus on research as practice, but also there's a new research institute being set up, which is called the Institute for Creative Practice, which focuses specifically on creative practice as research. And one of the themes, I think, will be socially engaged practice in photography and community engagement. So that's kind of my institutional interest. And then I have a personal interest, which I alluded to, having done photography with Liz, an ongoing research project. And within socially engaged practice and photography, I'm quite interested in knowledge transfer. So how can you communicate the themes and ideas of your research and embed that in the project, and then produce that as evidence in the output, as well as the artifacts and the photographs and whatever else you produce. So that's kind of the thing I'm interested in. And also the difference between practice-led and practice-based. I don't know whether anyone's familiar with these two terms, but it's a discussion point which we can have later as well, and hopefully we can unpick this when we look at the speakers' presentations. But I'll leave it there, and yeah, I very much look forward to hearing and seeing what people have been up to.
Thanks, Gary. So just a few kind of house rules for today. If everyone could put their mic off for now, if they're not a speaker, just so we don't get any background noise and it's a bit clearer when people are presenting. But then obviously when we get to the Q&A and the breakouts, obviously we want you to be as interactive as possible. So please turn your mics on and cameras on if you would like to, because we really do want this to be more of a discussion rather than just us chatting at you in the second half of the session. But just to give a little bit of an overview for those of you who don't know, this event is part of a broader network which is called the Socially Engaged Photography Network. Pretty much says what it does on the tin. It was a network that was set up actually off the back of a feeling that this particular type of practice isn't discussed enough across the field, maybe isn't celebrated enough, and actually that there's gaps for training opportunities, but also for people just to actually speak to each other, you know, even in a more intimate situation like this, about the challenges of working in socially engaged ways. And when we talk about socially engaged photography, we talk about it in the sense that it's when photographers and communities come together through photography to explore issues that are pertinent to them, whether that be local, global, social, or economic, or otherwise. And it's about how we bring people together to collaborate through photography to do that. So the network has been going for over a year now, and we actually reached our 300, we went over 300 members the other week. We're now at 304 members. So I was like, it's an exciting time because we started with about 20 of us last year. So it's really grown rapidly, which means there's hopefully a real demand and interest in it, which is great. But for today, as Gary said, we're having a kind of specific theme looking at practice as research. And so we're joined by two guest speakers who are going to talk to us about their current research projects. And I'm delighted to firstly introduce Kalina. So Kalina Brailsford is a photography lecturer, and her practice focuses around participatory photography projects. She is also currently an education and projects manager at Photo Voice. Kalina is her final year doing an AHRC funded PhD in photography, where she's specifically looking at the use of participatory photography for the re-engagement of young people, and specifically exploring ideas around visual literacy, engagement, and the use of participatory photography in an online environment, which seems very pertinent at the moment in the context that a lot of us are finding ourselves working in. So I'm going to hand over to Kalina Clean, I'll just make you a host so you can share your screen.
Hi everyone. I'm really sorry. You've been kind of, the whole session's been breaking up, and I just got a message my internet connection is not stable. I'm not sure what's going on. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm really sorry if I really apologize if it breaks up. I mean, it's yesterday my provider sent out a message that the internet's unstable. It's the first time it's happened since we've been in this situation. So I'm really sorry if it's not stable. So I'm going to share my screen now, and thank you, Liz, for the intro. Just set up my... Can people see? Okay. Okay. So my name is Kalina Brailsford, and I think Liz introduced me in a very comprehensive way, so I don't really need to say much more about that. But I'm going to talk specifically about my PhD research. I'm in my final year of my PhD. I recently switched to part-time because of my engagement with photo voice, and because of various reasons involving having to readjust things through COVID. My research is primarily workshop based, so that's been a challenge which I can talk about briefly as we go along. So my research, as Liz mentioned, is based around a NEAT perspective through participatory photography, and NEAT is a really horrible acronym which stands for Not in Education, Employment or Training. So this refers to young people who are sort of between the age of 18 and 24, but it's kind of not very clearly defined, and it's fluid in terms of its specific kind of framework. And then situating visual literacy in a culture of the networked photograph. So I'm very interested in aspects related to sort of meaning making, which is a big part of the methodology, and how are those narratives developed within the process. So my overarching research approaches is, my background is as an artist and photographer, and so I'm kind of positioning myself with practice-based artistic research. So when I started off, I thought, oh, this might be quite a nice way to do things, but actually it's quite a challenging way. And practice-based research in my case means that my communication, some of my communication outputs are not going to be in a written format. That also means that I'm using practice as generating knowledge, and I'm also using potentially, where appropriate, practice, artistic practice, to analyze some of the data. So then further, kind of my approach would sit broadly under visual ethnographic methodologies, and more specifically participatory photography is the kind of method I use mostly for my research. So that would involve, that is specifically a socially engaged practice for the kind of most methods I use in terms of the PhD. Okay. So my research aims are to critically explore participatory photography. So actually the methodology is very central to what I'm doing. So one of the things when I started my PhD was to look at how it could be applied in using sharing images online, using mobile phones, and kind of using these neat young people, sort of disengaged young people, with the methodology, using the framework of digital media and social media. When COVID happened, actually, that was interesting because it really accelerated these ideas for me. There was a huge demand for us to kind of start delivering remote workshops, doing projects online. And actually for my work at Photo Voice, that's one of the things that I did, was to kind of design how we can deliver the training online and use some of these aspects of participatory photography, which is quite an interactive way of working with people, to be able to translate in an online environment. So part of what I'm doing is kind of critically looking at some of these things around participatory photography, with specifically young people, neat young people. And then another important aspect of my PhD is sort of young people, and it's the cultural aspects of young people and social media and how they engage with photography. So this idea of the act of photography, the act of making photographs, and what that means. And then the last aspect is sort of this intersection of visual literacy and the networked image and this meaning making, because part of the participatory photography methodology, a key aspect is visual literacy, which helps participants, or is a tool that we use to help participants develop their narratives, and caption writing, developing those narratives, looking at photographs in a critical way is quite important. So I'm really interested in looking at what specifically that means in terms of the new digital image framework. So I'm just going to go through the sort of different ways I'm approaching these questions through my practice. And one of the main ways, as I mentioned, is workshops and participatory photography. I'm just going to play this video. Actually, I would need to stop sharing my screen for a second to share again, optimizing. Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Do you know, Liz, how that can be? Okay. I need to, there's a little tick box, optimize screen share for video clips. Sorry, I forgot to do that at the beginning. So, so this is a video of sort of it's a reflexive video of me responding to the workshop phase that I did with the participants. I did a pilot workshop. Well, I did a series of workshops, but this is one of the workshops I did with a group of young participants. And this is my reflexive approach using a video. So participatory photography is my main methodology, and I've run, as I said, a number of workshops, but I'm also using reflexive practice to kind of document some of the things that come up as what does it mean to be a facilitator, how are things for participants, and just generally looking at the kind of whole process in this combined way through my own reflections, in this instance using video, and through the work of the participants that they have produced. I'm also looking at sort of how any aspects of sort of mobile phones, ethical approaches to that, and considerations, image sharing, and things like that. As I said, captioning is quite important as part of the process, so looking at how do those narratives develop is quite important as well. I can send a link to the video if someone wants to watch the whole thing. I'm not going to go through all of it now. So the other interesting aspect of that I'm looking at is sort of the power dynamics between production and collaboration of socially engaged practice and participatory photography in particular. Where does the facilitator's input start and where does it finish? And this is, I kind of, in my own practice, the collaboration really, so the participants have kind of control over the process for the duration of the workshops, but at the sort of exhibition stages, the collaboration becomes, sort of my voice becomes a little bit more prominent. This is a piece of sort of how a participant photograph is combined, and I've curated it to be displayed as part of the exhibition at the end of the workshop. This was part of a summer lodge at Nottingham-Trent University. We did celebratory exhibitions when actually life allowed us to meet other people and go somewhere. Okay. So the second important kind of aspect of what I'm looking at is this idea of the act of photography. So I did another series of workshops with young people who are actually photography students. So they chose to explore this idea of the selfie and image sharing. So some very interesting ideas came out of that as well. This is a piece of work called Selfie by Strangers. So this particular participant went out and asked people to take photographs of him, and we kind of talked about what does that mean. Spaces, where do you feel comfortable to take selfies? So students kind of developed their own themes and came up with these reflections on what all of these ideas mean to them, which we then documented, discussed, and then exhibited in a collaborative exhibition. What's on the other side of the selfie camera? So whilst the camera is looking at you, what is it actually seeing on the other side? And this kind of idea of how the technology collaborates to create these selfie images, and you know, in this instance, how real are they? And the other kind of important thing to mention here is on this particular aspect is sort of how I do my reflections as well. So I do a combination of, like I said, I use video to document some of the process in a reflective way. And also I use writing as a form of practice. So I use something called sight writing, which is a form of situated writing, but I use photographs as a something to respond to. So that's kind of in line with the participatory photography methodology. So I applied a methodology in a way to myself for my own reflexive writing. In this instance, I'm not going to read it because it's quite long, I'm responding to this idea of nothing is all I captured from that night, because I have this huge resistance to taking photographs myself, but I've yet delegated it to other people, and I strongly believe that taking photographs is a really interesting, really good way of kind of reflecting on things, but yet I have a resistance to do it myself, or at this point of time I do. So I'm kind of using my own situation and relationship with photography to reflect on some of these questions as well. And then the last third aspect of my practice is, and the theme that's that's kind of relevant to my research, is visual literacy and the sort of this intersection with the networked image. So I'm kind of looking at this idea of meaning making and this idea of looking at photographs, making meaning, which is very central to participatory photography and the workshop environment. But I'm taking it further by running a series of photographs through online algorithms and to see what sort of captions they come up with. So in this instance, I have the shadow is my doubt, which is something a participant did in one of the workshops, and then the algorithm came up a close-up of red flowers. So I'm kind of using this form of practice to communicate some of the ideas around meaning making, around how does technology collaborate and where does meaning kind of reside, and what is visual literacy in this whole process of participatory photography. And some of the more sort of intriguing ones are a picture containing cake birthday decorated covered, which I thought was funny. Oh, sorry. And this is a really funny one. A person wearing a suit and tie talking on a cell phone. And again, I'm kind of going through the data. So this is a form of kind of using, again, creative practice for analyzing. So again, I've combined some of the exhibition work that we've done. I've run it through, again, the algorithm, And then I'm sort of at that stage where I'm putting all the data kind of outputs of my practice together, which will probably become a combination of sort of multimedia approach. Ideally, people will be having a kind of body of work in either an online or physical sense, where they will engage with it through video, through pictures, through writing. And that's kind of my idea for the outputs. If it's a physical book, they will be scanning barcodes and videos and audio files might be coming up on their phones, and that's kind of my latest thinking about pulling all the practice elements together for my research. I think that's it, really. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kalina. I will just reclaim my host. There we go.
Was that okay? Was I breaking up a lot?
No, I could hear you fine.
Oh, that's great. Thank God.
I think, yeah, we have some good thumbs. We have up thumbs.
Okay, thank you.
So what we're going to do is we're going to hold questions for now. We're going to hear from the next speaker, and then we'll kind of go into a full room discussion, if that's okay with everyone, just to keep the time going. But Lisa, if I just make you, oh, do I need to reclaim my host still? I do. There we go. So I'll just make you host, Lisa, if you want to get your presentation ready while I introduce you. Is that okay?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, there you go. So I'm delighted to now invite Lisa Alroyd to join us. So Lisa is a practice-based PhD student at the University of Central Lancashire, where she's researching the importance of personal archives and the collection of personal histories. As a photographic practitioner, she specialises in social engagement and community-based projects, along with social documentary photography. Lisa is active within social engagement and collaboration in visual arts, and she works mainly with women from working class backgrounds within her immediate local community. She's done a number of other projects, which I'm going to let her talk about rather than me waffle on. But it's also worth saying that Lisa's, so as the opposite to Kalina, Lisa's right at the beginning of her research journey, so it's quite interesting to hear from the pair. So I'll just hand over to you now, Lisa, if you're ready.
Yeah, you should be able to see my screen.
Yeah, we can see that.
Yeah. Okay then. So thank you for the introduction and thanks for having me. So as Liz said, I'm right at the beginning of my PhD. I'm going to take you through some of my long-term engagement projects and show just a select few stages of how I've got to where I am now. I'm still working through and finalising and finishing off like methodologies and research context as well. So if you do have any questions, we're having questions at the end. So from the introduction, I've completed my BA and my MA both in photography. I've taken part in conferences like this, talk about this kind of research and social engagement. I've produced work and collaborative work for exhibitions. And for the past 4 or 5 years, I've been working in the area of social engagement, predominantly focusing on my local community, specifically a local women's luncheon club. I started my PhD via practice-based research in April. I've recently changed mode to part-time because of the complications that I think we're all having at the moment with COVID. And it will be specialising in photography, social engagement, and personal histories as archives. So I'm going to take you to the starting point of my work. And this was when I first met my local community group called the Lazy Daisy Luncheon Club. And it is a luncheon club for over 55 ladies in the area. And I started working with them as a group to make more of a presence in our local community, because the numbers were quite low, and we knew that there were other people that needed to be encouraged to come out of the house and interact with other people. So we created a newsletter and promotional information for the group, and it was successful. More people came out and started to interact with the group, which was really good. But I slowly started to become embedded in the group and create relationships with the group members. I got to know them. And these images I remember showing at my first final exhibition from, I think, my BA. And it was the first starting point that I started to work with participants in a socially engaged manner. Number 34 came directly off working with the participants on an individual basis. These images in particular from when I was working with a lady called Margaret, and we, like a few of us, got to know each other quite well. And we started to notice that a lot of the ladies in the local area were suffering with isolation, loneliness, well-being issues. So I started to go and visit them outside of the community group, and we started to look at their surroundings and how they dealt with isolation and well-being. They started to be a little bit more open when we were working together. So we started talking about why they surrounded themselves with the objects that we do at home. So as most humans, we have our objects in our house that bring us comfort. When looking at ladies of an older generation, you find that they have more objects, more items, more sentimental objects. And this turned into a bigger project. So the research took me into that direction. So we started looking at the objects in isolation and well-being in that community, specifically in that group. And we looked at self-curation, so how we as humans, or how they as the participants, curated their surroundings, looking at the items that might not be of monetary value, but of personal value. After I worked with Renee and Margaret on a one-to-one basis, we took that back to the group, the larger group. So there was about 10 of us in the end working on this, and it was just at the back end of last year. And we noticed that it was an unspoken topic. So they were all suffering in this group with isolation issues, and they weren't talking to other people about it. So we started to get them to bring in personal items, and we were looking at their own personal histories. And it was really good because they started to open up and start this conversation and form their own group while they were looking at these items. A lot of the ladies carried on with going to the luncheon club, and it became it was a very vital part of the community. I'm saying it was only because they've had to shut given COVID, and it has had a massive knock-on effect to the attendees of the group. So taking that into consideration, I then started looking at personal histories. So hopefully by now you can see that even though they are mild, the participants are the same, the subjects have slightly changed, and that's gone off the research that I've done, which has then taken me into different aspects of the project. My personal histories started in my final year of my master's, and it was only worked on with Rini. So all these images that you'll see are just from the one participant. And we looked at more in depth of importance about personal history, sentimental items, and personal archiving. The point at when we were looking at how women of this age and the background, the working class background, was underrepresented in our archive system nationally and locally. So we then, for my master's exhibition, I took and we talked to the local archive system, and for my final output, with the permission of Rini, we decided to create her own archive. So we both went along and we looked at, we did like a mini day course with the archive, and we created Rini's own archive box. So for my final output there, every single item that was in the box we put on display. It was just a small snippet of her own history. So while working together, we developed a small framework that we could use with other participants, and then hopefully we can take it to larger groups to work on at the same time. The installation was set like Rini's front room, so we had the rug and the carpet, but the important bit was the interactive and immersion side of it. So you could pick up some of the objects that you can see in the images. We had photo cards, we had textiles, we had things that you could pick up and look at her history. And that's important because while we are digitizing everything as photographers and we might have a digital presence, when we are looking at archiving, there is not a lot of these histories unless you are wealthy or unless you are a significant social value. So it's important that we look at the everyday person, the person that makes society tick as a whole. So current development, so we're up to date now. I started the practice-based PhD. It is predominantly a socially engaged approach to the role of personal archives of the working class older woman. I didn't think in 2017 that I would be starting this PhD and where I am now with this topic, I must admit. And I think that can be said for a lot of practitioners. Practice-based research really informs my practice. Like most of us as photographers, we look, we do, and then we go back. And I think it's quite prevalent that that's how I do work. And that's why I've taken the practice-based PhD. When I've been working, or any advice that I would give to people that are working in this way with practice-based research or practice-led research, is that you have to let the research that you are doing and the information that you gain from your practice, you have to let that give you an opportunity to explore other places and other branches of ideas and themes and topics. And I think that's really important. And especially working with participants, you've got to allow your work to flow. It's got to be fluid, but yet informed. Just a little practical bit at the end. If you are starting out and you're maybe listening to me and thinking I'm just waffling, these 3 books have been really important to me since starting, especially the middle one, Photographers and Research. This goes through photographers in the field and how they work with their research and how they then use that research to inform their practice. Thank you. I hope that was all right.
Thanks so much, Lisa. You just want to stop sharing your screen and then
If I can work out how to.
I'll,
There.
there
Yeah.
we go.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. I'll just reclaim host again. There we go. Yeah, so thank you to both of you. That was really useful. Like I said, it's really interesting for me to hear you both at such different ends of the research journey. And some of the stuff you were saying, well, both of you actually, it's just reminded me of when I did my master's of research, which is nowhere near the level of having to do a PhD, and still I was a bit like, oh, those stressful moments. I'm remembering them already. But I thought it would be quite nice if we can open it up to the floor now, to the room for any questions. If it's easier for people, please just put them in the chat box, and then I can just ask them for you. Or if you'd like, you can raise your hand. You just have to give us a minute to check the screen to people who are doing it that way. But Gary, I think you had a question you wanted to ask in the meantime, didn't you? You wanted to ask that one.
Yeah, thanks both. That was really interesting. And it is good to hear the different ends of the spectrum, I guess. But my question kind of works for both of you. Is that I think a PhD by practice or a practice-led PhD, however you want to frame it, is a very difficult thing to do. And I think to find someone or people who have a visual skill and a critical and analytical skill and combine that is actually quite rare. So I was wondering, just on your journey, and I know you're at different ends of the journey, have you had, or do you feel you could have benefited from having a different, don't know, scholarly engagement? You know, could the universities, could a BA in photography do more in terms of preparing people to be reflexive, or do you think practitioners have less, are given less chance to write, or vice versa?
Is that okay? If
I'm just I'm generally interested to see, you know, what's your thinking, because as I say, I think it's quite a difficult thing to do, more so than people give credit for.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember, I mean, Lisa probably it's more fresh for her, but I can remember, and sort of my beginning of my journey, it was really hard because I thought I'm getting into one thing, but it turned out to be another thing. And even little things like, when I talk about this cross-university with other students or people engaging in practice-based research, the language around it is even different, and what it means is very different. So we call it practice-based research, and my university is very specific to call it that way. Other universities are very specific to call it in other ways. But actually the reality was no one could tell me, and I work in an office with a number of students who are in the same situation. It was very hard to navigate all of that, really. And particularly sort of looking at the difference between practice-based, practice-led. We have, again, in our university, specific terms what this means. One is informed by practice. The other one is the practice itself is what communicates the research or embodies the research. So it's really, really difficult, actually. As someone starting off, I think there's definitely scope on an institutional level to work with this and to kind of, I don't know, offer support, because I'm part of a AHRC funded PhD with part of as a group M4C consortium of universities. And there's a lot of training, which is great at the beginning, offered for, you know, all sorts of research approaches, but nothing that was relevant to me specifically or to people like me. So we ended up doing a conference and some sort of workshops around this as students, and, you know, we got funding around that. So it's kind of actually really tricky. That's my experience.
I'd agree. So I came fresh out of the MA and started the PhD, and it was quite a shock to the system, I must admit. I think there could be more scope for the MAs to prepare you to going on to that academic language. It is a completely different arena when you're talking to your academics or your supervisory team. I've been lucky. I've got quite a very good supervisory team, and my director of studies, she's gone through a lot on the protocols on what to do. But starting out, it was very difficult. They have a lot of training, like Kalina said, but when you handed a big textbook of training, you don't necessarily know where to start. So I think the MA or something in between, there could be a better bridging, definitely.
Actually, that's a really good point, Lisa, because I think we talked about this in one of our meetings beforehand. My MA didn't involve a lot of writing. I chose to write. Yeah. That was I think we had a chat about that. I chose to do a written piece of work because I knew I'm going to progress potentially into a PhD. But I think as visual artists or, practitioners, writing is not my form of expression necessarily, like a go-to way. So that was a big leap, and there wasn't really support with that as well. And I don't think you kind of realize before you embark on that journey the sort of framework you're going to be boxed in, which is very different from the MA, at least for me. I think that what Lisa was saying reminded me of that, really.
Yeah, it's because on my MA, I personally chose quite practical modules, not thinking about going on to PhD level. So I chose to pick those practical levels. So I do think definitely there needs to be some support or some options there for practice-based academics.
And in fact, I'm almost at the point where I have to wrap everything up, and I'm still unclear. Some people have told me, no, you cannot go over 40,000 words. Then other people tell me, whatever your practice equivalent that communicates your research, then you're substituting what's ever left with words. So there's not even a clear kind of boundary how you're supposed to wrap this up, even in the same institution. And then we have examples from my supervisor works in Norway, and you can just deliver your research entirely without necessarily doing any academic writing. So it's kind of really tricky as well, that kind of what's required of you is not clear as well, I think.
I think it's this practice. If it was like, if it was the 80,000 word thesis and you're very academic about it, there is more guidelines, but as you are this practice based, it seems to be a little bit of an unknown or an unexplored. So I think, there needs to be some framework for it.
Thank you. I think me and Gary both teach on masters, so we're taking all this in as to actually how we can help.
Sorry.
No, this is all really useful because it can help us think about actually we can help with students that maybe are, even in a longer distance, thinking about those PhD options and how we can actually make them accessible for them. We've had a few questions in from some of the room. There's a question off Emily, who was just saying that she loved hearing about the local group that you were talking about, Lisa. But she wondered if you knew if the ladies had managed to kind of keep connected online during COVID, and actually how you've still kind of kept involvement with them during this time. And that might be a broader question actually about these types of projects in general, and kind of how are they working practically during COVID, but also do you imagine actually that that's going to be something you're going to end up writing about in terms of the research if your methods have to change, so in the written side of it as well?
Yeah, definitely. So COVID was a surprise for the whole world, I think. So I'll start with the question. I have kept in contact with the majority of the ladies from the group personally. A lot of them are of the age where they don't necessarily have a computer or a smartphone, but we exchanged a contact tree. So instead of trying to continue the project on the personal histories, I've tried to keep them connected. So I put my research aside almost for that community, that group, just so they can keep connected. And then once safe to do so, because that is the point, that it's their safety that is the issue. So they're keeping connected via telephone. I'm contacting them most of the time. So hopefully when we do come out of this, we can go back to our Ladies' Days and Luncheon Clubs, and we can connect on a face-to-face basis. It is something that I am currently writing into my RPA stage, is about the COVID impact on the research.
What about you, Kalina, in terms of your...
Yeah, I realized I didn't really mention much about that in my presentation, but basically my original plan was to, and which is what I did, I ran workshops with a few groups based in Nottinghamshire. And my idea was to explore sort of the use of mobile phones and kind of look at engagement through that camera use, and also kind of image sharing, which then I explored sort of this idea of safeguarding, because there's a lot of issues related to people just sharing images, and I kind of had to think about that. But when COVID came, it really accelerated me into kind of having to deliver online. And that has been actually quite challenging, because one of the things about running workshops in this kind of, using this kind of method, is that you want to create a safe space, a group dynamic. There's the collective meaning making, people getting together, getting to know each other, talking about their images, you know, holding physical images. So it took me actually quite a long time, and I was already working at PhotoVoice at the time, to kind of really test and put those things into practice, and it's been really, really challenging. But I'm at a point now where I can say actually it works doing the project remotely, and there's quite a lot of things to think about. But actually recruitment has been very challenging for online, because I think there's a lot to be said about Zoom fatigue or screen fatigue. Maybe initially we had more success with kind of engaging people through screens. People were feeling isolated, you know, that was a really good way of things happening. But right now I think people are just really struggling with just being on screens all the time. It's really challenging. So and there's really a lot of different things to think about, especially when working with vulnerable groups, with younger people in my case. Even on Zoom, can they send direct messages to each other? That might be potentially a problem if they don't know each other. Can they take screenshots? I don't include any faces of my participants, but I have no control over what screenshots maybe, you know, other participants might be doing, and sort of the dissemination of images. So there's a lot of ethical considerations as well, which need to be really thought out when embarking on remote delivery.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's something that's kind of in the forefront of all of our minds who work in this type of way. But and I imagine that will definitely seep into what you're going to end up writing about.
Yeah, for me it's very relevant. So in a way, it's kind of, as much as it's been difficult, it's been also exciting, because it's actually taken some of my questions on and even sort of accelerated them to a new level. But it's been challenging, I have to say.
We have, so we just had a comment from Dawn, who was just basically echoing and completely agreeing with you about the fact that she felt you know, she did a practice-based PhD, and she remembers it took her a long time to work out what she was doing and if it was in fact practice-based research. So just making you all feel at home together with that. But we do have a question from Laura, which starts with help, so I hope we can help. She says, I'm very much struggling with writing the brief to invite members to participate in a collaboration for her PhD. She does not yet have an established community to go to, and is aiming to create an online community around her projects. So any pointers on the language, length, or level of details that the brief might cover? And also, when we talk about online collaboration, are there any preferred channels or platforms that maybe you have been using at the moment? So I don't know if anyone wants to, maybe about the brief first, if you've ever been in that situation, thinking about how you do that initial call out to participants.
I've sorry, I've just actually been writing one last week because I'm just going to do my final set of workshops. And I mean, I totally get that. And one of the things for me that's I know is important from my experience as well is just to keep it very simple. Keep it short and simple, and make sure that it's clear what participants are going to get out of this. And for example, if it's remote delivery, one of the things that it's important to think about is, would people have internet access? So we often might offer vouchers for data vouchers so that we can make sure people aren't excluded. Also on the brief, it's important to know participants know what to expect, sort of how long the sessions will be, when they will be, what equipment is required of them. If they're going to be online, is it going to be, can they engage through phones? Do they need a computer? Do they need to download an app? But this has to be kept very brief and succinct, really. And my preferred, I've tested quite a few platforms, and Zoom seems to be the best option so far because of its breakout room feature. There's not many platforms that offer that. People can just click on a link and they can then engage in a live session. In terms of platforms for sharing images, Padlet.com is a really good platform for people to use to share their images, and it's a collaborative tool. So if you haven't used that before, I'd highly recommend it for that.
Yeah, I'd agree with the brief. Keep it very simple, very easy to understand, no matter who it's to. Just keep it very honest, open, and make sure that they know what you want and what they want. So what they'll get in return and how you're going to work as a team as well. Just use very easy language to engage with them.
Thanks, Lisa. I think as well is that we at OpenEye we have a general saying that if you can't fit an attractive visual image on there and have the text on an A4 piece of paper, there's too much on there. So that if you want to think about a physical amount of space for writing something, we tend to try and do that. And actually that comes from our marketing team, who are thinking about just how you make everything as accessible as possible in general. But it is a good trick to, particularly with people like me who are terrible with things like word count. So yeah, thank you for that.
On that note, actually a really good point as well is not to keep the text blocks really big, but just like have time, date, and then maybe one kind of text block, rather than split the information so it visually makes sense as well.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions, so I'll just go down to the chat. So a question from Becky was, how do you choose what to practice without any research? So do any practitioners work outside of the academy? So I'm guessing that's kind of around this idea of what comes first, maybe, or how much can you do without being part of a formal institution when you're thinking about practice as research? If I'm not reading that question correctly, Becky, please do correct me. Am I saying it right? Is that what you want to ask? No. Yes, that's what she meant. I'm just checking. So I don't know if anyone would want to answer first.
Is this open to everyone, or is this for us? Sorry, I'm a bit.
I think anyone to answer, but
okay.
As our speakers, we pick on you first, Kalina and Lisa. That's what we're here to do.
Okay.
Well, I'm very practical, so I don't know. I started my project out of the investigating how social engagement worked. So I knew that there was something that I wanted to look at initially. And then as my practice and as I've developed through with participants, that's how it's then got onto the research. Is that kind of what you're looking for? Is that the way?
I would say, in addition to that, you've all got that visual impulse to take pictures. Then I think alongside that, you always need to do a bit of reading and a bit of kind of thinking and writing to marry the two along, I think.
Yeah.
Guide anyway, if you were kind of starting out and you found something you were visually interested in, my suggestion would then to go and kind of read about the mechanisms of the hows and whys you're doing it, and what do you think the intentionality behind the photos are, and then you can work image criticality, reflexivity almost in tandem.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same. I guess I see my practice as a kind of contemporary practice. You have something, an exploration, which takes you on a journey through your image taking, through learning, through exploring, through speaking to people, to critically engaging with whatever it is that you're interested in. I guess that's how I've ended up doing a PhD. And frankly, yeah, I mean, I've run quite a few projects outside of academia as well, and part of me is actually really looking forward to not doing a PhD and just being able to do it because the PhD has quite a very rigid framework, and actually being just a practitioner who's working in that way would feel for me at least, because I'm kind of a bit at the end of this, feel really good as well. So
you've also got to get that balance as well. If you are in academia, but you are a practical person, you want to be out taking images, creating images. You want to be able to keep that going, and you just let it flow. It's hard to explain. So once you've taken the images and you've gone one way or the other, let your reading inform it, but also give yourself a break, allow yourself to go and create work.
I think we've got another question from Dawn. I think you had your hand up, Dawn.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's more of a kind of observation to add into that discussion about kind of research inside and outside of academia, because I am in academia quite literally right now, but I'm working on a project with a colleague that is a collaborative and participatory project called Boys of Isolation, which is about queering selfies on social media. And we found, because we're in academia, and we've been very stringent with our ethics, as we should be when working with participants and sharing their images, but actually the Qualtrics form, which is an ethics and consent form that the participants have to go through, is actually a barrier to participation, because people just find it scary because it's quite long-winded. So we think we have lost a few participants because of the kind of structure of academia. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there.
No, it's a really good point, Dawn. I think in one of the breakouts we're going to do in a little bit, that's one of the topics actually is the very ethics of the very processes we need to go through in order to do the participation kind of becomes a barrier to the participation.
Yeah, and I think Dawn is right, because I've had in my experience actually a very curious situation where I've embarked on partnerships, because that's sort of the nature of my practice, with help with recruitment. And if I come in as an artist, there's no problem in terms of the recruitment, but if I come in as the PhD researcher and this whole system on my shoulders, then they just will not go ahead with it. And whereas the process itself would have been exactly the same. So it's kind of a really interesting thing to think about, actually. And that's not to say that as a practitioner I don't have an ethical framework and rigid consent forms. It's just the way it's set up, and maybe sometimes even just saying that that's what's attached to your practice is tricky.
Just checking no one had any other questions. I think I had one more, and then we're due for a break, which was just to both of you. You may have already actually touched upon this, but it was just to say, what has been the most challenging aspect of trying to frame your practice as research so far? And you might have very different ideas of that depending on how long you've been trying to frame it as research for.
You want to go first?
Yeah, go on, you go, Lisa.
All right, okay. So for me, like I said, it was the shock between the MA and the PhD, so very practical and the very academic. I think it's a very large step, but I have had the support at the academic level to be able to go through all the frameworks and the training. And I am very lucky in the support that I've had, but I'll go back to what we said before, and that is that there needs to be a connector, a bridge, a support for very practical MA-based practitioners coming into a very academic, practice-led researcher. So yeah, it's touching on the comments before, but yeah.
Lena, do you want to add anything?
Sorry, I completely got distracted at reading in the chat, so I'm not sure I got the question. I'm very bad at multitasking, so
I can't see the chat.
yeah, that's why I didn't want to look at it, but then
I can't see it.
You opened a can of worms when we started reading it. I was just asking what's been the most challenging aspect of framing your practice as a research so far?
Well, one of the things that's really challenging, because participatory photography as a method, as a framework, is very broad, and you have people writing about it, coming into it from different points of entry. You know, you might have arts-based practitioners, photographers, social scientists, and also my supervisory team was made up of sort of humanities, social science background person, and a more kind of photography background. And it was really actually challenging to kind of position myself in terms of how to even get started. It was actually really tricky for me initially. And defining, because with participatory photography, you could go down the route of just traditional PhD in terms of sort of you're informing your writing through the workshops, but it's kind of defining what the practice is, how you're going to be reflexive about it, and how you're going to communicate this through the practice was very tricky for me. So
I have just got one last question that someone's just asked, and then I'm going to suggest we do our break before our breakout. So the last question is from Lisa, which is, could I ask if anyone has got into any difficulty over intellectual property with their university whilst doing a PhD?
Yeah, for me.
Oh, someone. I heard someone say yes, me. I can't see them.
I said no, not for me, not yet.
Oh, no. You're like a quiet voice.
I had issues initially, but they're no longer issues, but it's definitely something to think about, especially if you're potentially being funded or you're starting off as a sort of, when I started my PhD, I was potentially going to be part of this project where we're going to develop a social image sharing network as part of the process. And that became an issue in terms of like who's going to have ownership after that. So there's things to think about. I mean, particularly with copyrights, in terms of copyrights, it depends on how of the images and the work that's produced. That's another topic, because you have to decide in terms of, in my instance, is my practice, copyright is retained by my participants. I'm kind of sort of the exhibition in a curatorial capacity, then we work together in more collaborative ways. So, but there's quite a lot of things to think about in terms of copyright, especially in collaborative practice, really, because the university shares copyright as well. So one of the things I was thinking about is publishing a tool for delivering workshops online, but then it gets also tricky because I'm also working with photo voice. So depending on sort of your setup, you have to really think about copyrights, depending on how your research is informed and if you're in collaboration with other organizations, really, because the university will also want to have a say in that. But there's an option to have a meeting with the legal team of the university so you can kind of customize this at the beginning if that's potentially an issue for you.